Welcome to MVCC Learning Commons Math Shorts. In this topic, we will be talking about adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators. In our first example, we will be adding 2/5 plus 3/10. So when we're adding fractions, we have to have what's called a common denominator, which means that the denominators in both of the fractions are the same. As you can see, for our two fractions here, our denominators in our fractions are not the same value. We have a 5 in the first fraction and a 10 in the second fraction. So we need to find our common denominator, or some people like to call it a common multiple. So I'm going to abbreviate my common denominator as CD off to the side here. And we want to think of a common multiple for both of these numbers. So we can probably have a common denominator of 10. That is a common denominator or a common multiple that we can use for both of them. If you didn't think of 10, if you thought of 20 or 50, you can use any of those. When we reduce at the very end, there will be more reducing for larger common denominators, but any of those numbers will work. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fix our fractions so that they have the same denominator. So 3/10 already has the common denominator I want. So I'm just going to rewrite it. I don't need to change it. It's already the way it needs to be. 2/5 though, I need to adjust it. I need to make it so that it has a denominator of 10. So I think to myself, 5 times what gives me 10? And that will be 2. So I'm going to multiply my denominator by 2. So I have 2 times 5 gives me 10. If I multiply the denominator by a certain value, I have to also multiply the numerator by that same number. So I multiply the top by 2 as well. On the top, I have 2 times 2. So my numerator becomes 4. Now I can add my fractions because they have the same denominator of 10. When I add fractions, my denominator stays the same. That does not change. And I add the numerators. 4 plus 3 gives me 7. At the end here, I'm going to check to see if I can reduce. Does 7 and 10 contain any common factors? And they don't. So 7/10 would be my answer here. For the next example, I have 5/6 minus 1/2. I want to do the same process for subtraction that I do for addition. I still need to have a common denominator. So I'm going to write that off to the side here. What would be my common multiple or my common denominator for both 6 and 2? For those numbers, I could have a common denominator of 6. Now, if you thought of 12 or 24, any of those numbers, they would work as well. Again, you would just need to do more reducing at the end. I'm going to fix my fractions again, like I did for the first example. As you can see, my first fraction already has the common denominator I want, so I don't need to change it. I'm just going to keep it the same and write it down. My second fraction, however, 1/2, it needs to be adjusted. I need to fix it so that it has a denominator of 6. So 2 times what gives me 6, and that would be 3. I multiply the bottom by 3 in order to get my common denominator. And because I multiply the bottom by 3, I also have to multiply the top by 3. So 2 times 3 gives me 6 for the denominator. 1 times 3 gives me 3 for my numerator. They now have the same denominator, so I can subtract my fractions. I again keep the same denominator, and I subtract my numerators. So 5 minus 3 gives me 2. Again, make sure to check at the end to see if you can reduce, and in this case, I can. 6 and 2 share a common factor of 2. So here I can divide both of those numbers by 2 to reduce my fraction. So I'm going to divide the top by 2 and divide the bottom by 2. And my numerator, I get a 1, and my denominator, I get a 3. So my end answer is 1/3. For my last example here, I have a combination of addition and subtraction. Again, the same process is going to happen. I'm going to find a common denominator, and then I'm going to change all the fractions so that they all have that common denominator. So I need to look at all of the denominators all at once to make sure that I have the correct common denominator. So I have to include 3, 4, and 6 when I find my common denominator for this question. So if I look at 4 and 6, my common denominator, or my common multiple, could be 24. I have this 3 as well. That would work in that, but 12 works as well. Right? 3 times 4 is 12. And then 6 times 2 gives me 12. So I'm going to use 12. If you want to use 24, that would work. Just remember you would have to reduce more at the end. So here I have to fix every single fraction. I have to multiply every fraction by a value in order to get 12 for all of my denominators. So for my first fraction, I have a denominator of 3. So what times 3 gives me 12? And that would be 4. So I'm going to multiply the top and the bottom by 4 here. Squeeze this in on the side here. So 4 times 3 gives me a denominator of 12. And then 4 times 2 gives me a numerator of 8. bring my plus sign down. My next fraction has a denominator of 4. So what times 4 gives me 12? That would be 3. So my next fraction, I'm going to multiply the top and bottom by 3. So 3 times 4 gives me my denominator of 12. 3 times 3 gives me my numerator of 9. Bring down my minus sign. My next fraction has a denominator of 6. 6 times 2 would give me 12. So I'm going to multiply my last fraction by 2 on top and on bottom. 6 times 2 gives me 12, and 5 times 2 gives me 10. Now from here, in order to finish the problem, I'm going to add and subtract from left to right. So I start with addition. 8 plus 9 gives me 17. I keep the denominator of 12. And then afterwards, I subtract 10. So 17 minus 10 is 7 over 12. Again, just make sure to check for if you can reduce at the end. 7 and 12 do not share any common factors, so 7 over 12 will be your final answer.